In the midst of her present speech, it was when she reached the words, "She has had a child," she gesticulated with her hands, forgetting to hold the folds of her long dressing gown. Released from her fingers, her robe fell apart, revealing the fact that beneath her skirt her legs and feet were bare. It was then that she imagined she beheld, mingling with the dazed, indulgent, stupid courtesy of Sam's attention to her, that particular look upon his face that women are so quick to catch. The look, namely, of a displeasure rather than a pleasure at some intimate and revealing gesture they have made. That such a look should have appeared on her idolized Sam's face on this night of all nights hurt her to the quick. It was a swift blinking of the eyelids, a scarcely perceptible twitch of the chin, but she received the impression that the sight of her bare ankles had affected him as something disconcerting. She knew well that a normal man have two distinct reactions to a girl's bare legs. The first one of provoked desire, with all its glamour and mystery, and the second one of fastidious shrinking. And although towards her idolized love she was humble as a child with her beauty, she was almost as shy and touchy as a child about any personal exposure. The fact, therefore, that she had caught, or fancied she had caught, for in reality Sam was not thinking of her legs at all, that particular look upon his face, made her anger leap up furiously against them both, against herself for forgetting to conceal her ankles, and against him for that unconscious flicker of cold-blooded awareness that caused her to feel conscious of them. Her anger with Holy Sam, like her anger against her old, idolized doll, made her totally forget that this dazed, well-meaning man, sitting up in such an absurd posture of forced attention, with his heels under the chair and his head raised, was her romantic idol. And in one swift, ungovernable impulse, she seized him by the hair of his head and shook his skull with all her force backward and forward, repeating those interrupted words, "More about than any man, more about than any man," over and over again. Sam, in his unimaginative simplicity, thought the girl was doing this for fun, or at least an amiable irritation. He was so full of her startling words about Nell that to have his hair seized upon and his skull shaken was an interlude of small moment. But when she let him go and flung herself down sobbing upon the bear rug, he realized that it was anything but fun. He realized then that he knew no more about the ways of women than he knew about the philosophy of Nietzsche in dealing with them. He crouched down by her side on the bare rug and did his best to console her, not daring to snatch her arm away from her eyes, but petting and coaxing her in every way he could think of, and talking endearingly and tenderly to her. But she seemed to come to herself quite independently of his blundering consolation. All at once she scrambled swiftly to her feet. A curious notion had suddenly come into her head. "Give me your coat," she said. "I want to put on your coat." He obeyed her. He fetched his great coat. He held it for her while she slipped into it. Very gently, as she stood behind her, he extricated her curls and let them hang free over the collar. She took him by the hand and led him to the sofa. It satisfied something very deep in her to feel that old overcoat she knew so well wrapped about her. It was like covering herself with the finer essences of her love. She was completely mistress of herself now, and of Holy Sam too, as this latter felt in the very marrow of his bones. Every woman, the most abject as well as the most beautiful, has certain moments in her life when the whole feminine principle in the universe seems to pour through her, and when every man obeys her in helpless enthrallment as if she held the wand of Circe. This was the great hour of Crummie's life, nor was she ignorant of the nature of the magic that was now flowed through her veins. "Mr. Sam," she said, when they were seated side by side upon the sofa, "you must go down to Mrs. Zoyland's. Back to her and to your child. No, stop. I'm not finished. I don't mean go back to the vicarage. You were perfectly right in leaving your father. You can live out your new ideas freely without being independent. And as I say, there are some things women know more about than men, and one is that people who love each other ought to live alone together, never with a third one. When you left your Nell, you did it because you thought kissing her and loving her in that way was wrong. She never thought it was wrong. And now, Mr. Sam, you must live with her again, for I tell you those things are not wrong, but not as the vicarage. She ought never to have gone there. That's the one thing I cannot understand in Mrs. Zoyland, that she ever agreed to stay under the same roof with two men like you and your father." She paused upon this, giving Sam a flash of something more dangerous from her soft blue eyes than he had ever received. She looked so incredibly lovely in the dim light of that solitary candle, with her bright loose curls flowing over his own coat collar, that Sam stared at her in humble admiration. He was not in a mood to take exception to anything she said, and once having broken the ice and having got control of herself, she seemed prepared to say a great deal. "You are both very good men," she went on gravely, "but Mr. Decker cares nothing what people think. He doesn't seem to realize what scandal makers that old man and that old woman are. You ought to at once to take Mrs. Zoyland away. Then you and she will be the ones to get into trouble, if there is any trouble, and not your father. We're in the middle of great changes here in Glastonbury. Mrs. Zoyland and you, if you're brave enough to despise the Miss Drews and Miss Fells of the town, will have the support of her brother, Mr. Spear, and of course of my father and Mr. Trent. I don't know what furniture you've got in your attic in that old malt house. You see, I know all about you, Mr. Sam. But if you haven't got enough up there to make a woman and child comfortable, you ought to take furnished rooms. Why don't you go to Dickory Cantle, Mr. Sam? They're not fussy or squeamish there. Besides, Mr. Spear lives there now, and he's her brother. He'd help you with your expenses. He gets a good salary since my father's made him one of the big men in Glastonbury." Sam's whole nature was in a turmoil. As the girl's rapid, practical words followed one another, they carried a shameful conviction with them. Yes, he had been unforgivably selfish in all he had done. Little thought had he given to the passionate torment of his father, tantalized by Nell's sweet presence, and bearing the whole weight of that ambiguous situation. Little had he thought of what Nell might be enduring. He had thought solely of himself, solely of his own soul in relation to his martyred God. And meanwhile he had been cruel to his girl, and if not cruel to his father, at least completely irresponsible, completely careless of his peace of mind. With the lover's instinct combined with the instinct of a son, he knew exactly what his father would suffer if he took Nell away. But he also knew, who better, the deep relief with which the old man, left to himself, and free from the daily tantalization of his darker mood, would revert to his simple, traditional, unquestioning faith. Besides, Nell would go and see him. She would go often and see him. He wouldn't be separating those two. By removing her from the vicarage, he would be taking her out of his father's life. He wouldn't be taking her out of his father's life. Thus, as he watched that white face in the dimness, framed in its wavy curls, he gave himself reason upon reason for obeying the competent advice which came so impressively from its lips. But as he listened, the image of his sweet love's form, the caressing sound of her voice, the whole aura of her personality, rose up in the very heart of his being. It was perhaps an ironic thing, but the truth was that the mood he had been thrown into by his vision of the great Glastonbury mystery had abolished all his ascetic scruples about making love to Nell. Such scruples seemed to him now like a tight, irrelevant, self-inflicted contrariety. There was no doubt that if ever Sam came to talk of the secret things of his life, which was not very likely, with Mr. Evans, their incorrigible biographer of Merlin would have found this particular effect of the GRAIL vision a proof that the thing was a thing of magic and not of religion, and likely enough, like the mirrors of Gwyndon Granner, was an actual symbol of fertility. Well, Mr. Sam, I've got to have supper with Miss Drew tonight, and it's now 5 minutes to the hour she expects me. Even as she spoke, he was making his great decision. I'll take you to her door, little Crummy, he said. You've been more than a crumb of the loaf to me tonight, and if I do manage to establish myself at Dickory Cantle's, I'll pray to you every day as if you were a god. So he spoke, recalling a passage in one of the old poignant Homeric scenes which he had had to read when he was in the 6th form at Greyland School. Will you? She exclaimed, leaping to her feet and rushing to the chimney piece where the old candle was glittering down. Will you? She repeated, occupied with the struggle to light a second flame from the one that was drowning in its own melted wax. And then he became aware, from the heaving of her shoulders under his heavy coat, that Crummy was crying, not audibly, as she had done after shaking him, but silently. Having lit that second candle, she seemed to be seized with a mania for lighting candles, and went round the room doing it everywhere, but keeping her face hid from him. She might just as well have spared herself this illumination of her tragedy, for the tears were still running down her cheeks when she turned around. I don't know why I'm doing this, she said. It must be thankfulness because you're going to do what I've told you to do. As she spoke, she made an heroic effort to smile. For the beat of a swallow's wing, she could not compass it. Then she did, and the smile which wavered up, lovely and tender, from the very bottom of her soul, made her face, under the up-mounting flames of all her candles, more beautiful than any face that Holy Sam had ever seen. On their way to Miss Drew's, and they traversed Magdalene Street to its end, and then followed Beer Lane to the Tith Barn, thus avoiding the town, Crummy talked to him unreservedly about her father. He is fonder of me, she said in a low voice, when they reached the great medieval barn and paused, confronting it. Then Mother thinks he ought to be. Mother never has liked it. But I think nothing of it. I think it's silly to have those ideas about it. I suppose I'm queer in these things like that. And so is Father, except when it worries Mother. I don't mind. Why should I mind? His loving me so. He's getting a little weird. Alright, well, on that creepy note, I think I'll end it. Till next time, enjoy your day. Cheers from Glastonbury.